a poor rancher gave water to a wounded Apache warrior. By dawn, 500 tribal warriors surrounded his weathered barn. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Thomas Harker stood alone, one hand on his Winchester, the other gripping the worn wooden beam of his barn door. Dust rose from hundreds of painted horses, their hooves beating the earth like war drums. Sweat beaded on Thomas's forehead despite the cool morning air. His parched throat tightened as he counted the warriors, each face streaked with vermilion war paint, each lance pointed toward his heart. The sound of arrows being notched filled the silence. Thomas's knuckles whitened around his rifle. In the barn behind him lay the wounded Apache he had found near death by the creek, a young warrior no older than his own son would have been. The choice he'd made yesterday to help the boy now seemed to carry the weight of his own mortality. If 500 warriors aimed their weapons at your home for helping one of their own, would you stand your ground on principle or beg for mercy and denounce your actions? But what happened in the next heartbeat would forever change the story of the western frontier. 3 days earlier, Thomas Harker had been mending fences on the north side of his modest ranch. The late summer heat pressed down on his shoulders as he drove another post into the hard-packed berth. 17 years alone had taught him to work without complaint, to bear the weight of solitude like a second skin. His ranch wasn't much, a small herd of cattle, a barn that needed new boards, and a cabin that had seen better days. But it was his, paid for with the sweat of his brow and years of careful saving after the war. Each night, Thomas ate his dinner alone at a table built for 4. The empty chairs seemed to mock him, one for his wife Sarah, taken by fever 12 winters past, and another for his boy James, whose small grave rested on the hill behind the house. The third chair belonged to his daughter Emma, who had left for Denver 5 years ago, with promises to write that grew less frequent with each passing season. If stories of the frontier like this speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. The day that changed everything began ordinarily enough. Thomas had finished his morning chores and was leading his horse to the creek that cut through his property. The water was running lower than usual, but still clear and cool. As he knelt to fill his canteen, a sound caught his attention, a low moan, almost lost beneath the gentle babble of the water. 20 yards downstream, partially hidden by tall grass, lay a body. Thomas approached cautiously, his hand hovering near his holster. The young man was Apache, dressed in traditional garments, now soaked with blood from a bullet wound in his side. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and fever flushed his face. Around his neck hung a medicine pouch adorned with intricate beadwork. Thomas knew the tensions between settlers and the Apache had worsened in recent months. The cavalry had been pushing the tribes further into the mountains, and raiding parties had struck several homesteads north of town. The sensible thing would be to leave the warrior where he lay, or, more mercifully, to end his suffering quickly. Getting involved meant nothing but trouble. But as Thomas looked at the young man's face, he saw not an enemy, but a boy no older than James would have been. Without overthinking, he tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it against the wound to slow the bleeding. The warrior's eyes flickered open, dark with pain and suspicion. "I mean no harm," Thomas said, knowing his words meant nothing to the boy. Instead, he offered his canteen. After a moment's hesitation, the Apache accepted, drinking deeply. Thomas couldn't leave him to die. With care, he hoisted the wounded warrior onto his horse and led them back to his ranch. In the barn, he laid the boy on a bed of clean hay and set to work cleaning and dressing the wound as best he could. The bullet had gone through clean, which was lucky, but infection was setting in. Thomas brewed a poultice of herbs his wife had taught him to use and pressed it against the wound. As night fell, the warrior's fever worsened. Thomas sat beside him, changing the cool cloths on his forehead and offering water whenever he stirred. In the flickering lantern light, he noticed intricate tattoos on the boy's arm, symbols of a warrior who had proven himself in battle. "Hold on, son," Thomas whispered, though he knew the boy couldn't understand. "Just hold on." But his act of compassion would soon summon something far greater than gratitude. The next morning, Thomas rode into town for supplies and medicine. Millsville was little more than a dusty main street with a general store, saloon, and sheriff's office. As he tied his horse outside the store, he noticed a group of men gathered around a bulletin board where a new notice had been posted. "Mornin', Thomas," called Bill Parker, the storekeeper, as he entered. "Hear about the Apache raid on the Miller place? Took their horses and burned the barn. Miller's boy got shot trying to stop him." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "The boy make it?" "Touch and go. Doc's with him now." Bill leaned forward across the counter. "Army's offering $20 for any Apache caught or killed. Settlers are forming a militia to hunt him down." Thomas gathered his supplies quickly, adding bandages and a bottle of laudanum to his usual order. He could feel Bill's eyes on him. "Something wrong, Thomas?" "You seem in an awful hurry. Just got a lot of work waiting at home," he replied, paying for his goods. As he loaded his saddlebags, Sheriff Wade Cooper approached. The sheriff was a reasonable man who had served with Thomas in the war, but his patience with the Apache raids was wearing thin. "Thomas," he nodded, "haven't seen you in town for a while. Been busy with the ranch." The sheriff studied him. "You heard about the raids? Been hitting farms all through the valley. That creek of yours makes your place a likely spot for them to pass through." "Haven't seen anything unusual," Thomas said, avoiding the sheriff's gaze. "Well, if you do." The sheriff paused. "The Army's camped 10 miles north. Colonel Blackwood says he's going to solve the Apache problem once and for all." Thomas mounted his horse. "I'll keep an eye out." As he rode home, a knot formed in his stomach. The wounded warrior in his barn wasn't just any Apache. He was likely part of the raiding party. Thomas was harboring someone the Army and every settler for 50 miles wanted dead. When he returned, he found the warrior awake and alert, sitting up in the hay. The fever had broken. The young man watched Thomas warily as he approached with fresh bandages and food. "My name is Thomas," he said, pointing to himself. Then he gestured to the warrior. After a long pause, the Apache touched his chest. "Nalin," he said, "Black Wolf." Through gestures and broken words, Thomas learned that Nalin had been separated from his people during a confrontation with white settlers. He hadn't been part of the raid on the Miller farm. That was another band. But Thomas knew no one in Millsville would care about such distinctions. As Thomas changed Nalin's bandages, the warrior suddenly gripped his wrist. From his medicine pouch, he removed a small carved stone eagle and pressed it into Thomas's palm. The message was clear, a token of gratitude. That night, Thomas lay awake in his cabin, turning the stone eagle over in his fingers. He knew he should tell Nalin to leave as soon as he was strong enough, but the boy still needed at least another day to recover. His decision was made for him at dawn. The pounding on his door jolted Thomas awake. Sunlight was just beginning to filter through his windows as he grabbed his shirt and revolver. "Parker, open up!" The voice belonged to Frank Miller, whose son had been shot. Thomas opened the door to find Miller and 3 other men from town on his porch, all armed. "We're tracking Apache," Miller said without preamble. "Trail leads right through your creek." "I haven't seen any," Thomas replied, stepping outside and pulling the door closed behind him. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we take a look around? They might have left sign you missed." "I've been watching my property, Frank. There's nothing to find." One of the other men, Pete Dawson, spat tobacco juice on Thomas's porch. "Funny you'd be so sure. Almost like you don't want us looking." Thomas felt the weight of his revolver against his leg. "I've got work to do, so unless you've got something more than suspicions—" "Your horse has been ridden hard," Miller interrupted, gesturing to where Thomas's mare stood in the corral. "2 sets of tracks leading to your barn, but only yours coming out." Thomas kept his expression neutral. "I had to chase down a stray heifer yesterday. Rode a good 5 miles to bring her back. If your neighbors accused you of harboring an enemy of the entire territory, would you admit the truth or protect a stranger at the cost of your own standing?" Miller didn't look convinced. "We're going to have a look in that barn, Thomas." "No, you're not." Thomas's hand moved closer to his revolver. "Not without Sheriff Cooper or a warrant." The tension stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Finally, Miller stepped back. "The army's combing these hills, Thomas. If you're hiding something, they'll find it." His eyes were hard with accusation. "And if my boy dies while you're protecting one of them, I'll be back with more than just these men." After they left, Thomas hurried to the barn. Nolan was gone. The Apache had slipped away during the night, taking only a canteen of water and leaving the Stone Eagle behind. Thomas felt relief wash over him, followed quickly by concern. Nolan, stronger but still weak from his wound. Alone and injured, with settlers and soldiers hunting for Apache, his chances were slim. Thomas went about his chores that day with one eye always on the hills, wondering if Nolan had made it back to his people. As the sun began to set, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That night, as Thomas sat on his porch cleaning his rifle, a figure emerged from the darkness. He raised his weapon, then lowered it as he recognized Sheriff Cooper. "Evening, Thomas." The sheriff dismounted, tying his horse to the rail. "Wade?" Thomas nodded, setting his rifle aside. "Kinda late for a social call." Cooper sat heavily on the porch step. "Miller and his bunch came to me today. Said you were acting suspicious. Wouldn't let them search your property." He studied Thomas's face. "Said you might be harboring Apache." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "And you rode all this way based on Frank Miller's suspicions?" "I rode all this way because I've known you 20 years, and I wanted to hear it from you before things get out of hand." The sheriff leaned forward. "Level with me, Thomas. Have you seen any Apache on your land?" The moment stretched between them. Thomas thought of Nalen, wounded and alone, of the Stone Eagle in his pocket. "No," he said finally. "I haven't." Cooper nodded slowly. "I believe you. But Thomas," he lowered his voice, "Colonel Blackwood's arrived with 2 companies of cavalry." "He's not like other officers you've dealt with. He made his reputation hunting Apache in Arizona. They call him the Butcher of Tucson." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because if, and I'm not saying you did, but if you helped an Apache, even just gave him water," Cooper shook his head, "Blackwood wouldn't care about your reasons. He'd hang you as an example." After the sheriff left, Thomas sat alone on his porch, watching the darkness gather around his small ranch. The weight of his decision pressed down on him. Had he done the right thing, helping Nolan? Or had he put himself in danger for nothing? As he finally rose to go inside, a flicker of movement caught his eye at the edge of his property. A lone figure stood watching from the shadow of a juniper tree. For an instant, Thomas thought it might be Nolan returned, but the silhouette was wrong. Taller, broader in the shoulders. By morning, the figure was gone. But as Thomas stepped out to begin his chores, his blood turned to ice. Hundreds of mounted warriors lined the ridge above his ranch. Their faces were painted for war, feathered lances and bows catching the early light. At their center, seated on a magnificent painted horse, was an older warrior whose bearing marked him as a chief. Thomas stood rooted to the spot as a small party broke away from the main group and rode down toward his ranch. 5 warriors, including the chief, approached until they were 20 paces from where he stood. "I am Maka," the chief said in accented but clear English. "You gave water to my son. You cleaned his wounds." Thomas swallowed hard. "Nalin." The chief inclined his head. "He lives because of you, when others of your kind would have taken his scalp." His dark eyes bored into Thomas. "Why?" "Because he needed help," Thomas said simply, "just as any man would." For a long moment, Maka studied him. Then he turned and made a gesture toward the ridge. The hundreds of warriors began to descend, surrounding the ranch on all sides. And now Thomas stood in his doorway, one hand on his rifle, watching as 500 Apache warriors encircled his home. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley. Thomas's mouth went dry as he counted the warriors, their faces streaked with war paint, lances pointed toward his heart. If you were surrounded by hundreds of warriors with no hope of escape, would you face your fate with dignity or plead for your life? The chief, Maka, dismounted and approached. From behind him came Nalan, walking with difficulty but standing proud. The younger warrior nodded once to Thomas, a gesture of respect. "My son tells me you could have left him to die," Maka said, "that you gave him medicine and food when his strength was gone." Thomas nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "I couldn't just let him die." Maka's expression remained impassive. "The white soldiers hunt us. White settlers burn our camps and poison our wells. Yet you, alone among them, showed kindness to my son." From the distance came the sound of hoofbeats. Thomas turned to see a cloud of dust rising from the direction of town. Riders, at least 30 of them, were approaching fast. "That'll be the militia," Thomas said grimly, "and likely the army with them." Maka followed his gaze. "Colonel Blackwood, we know of him. He has killed many of our people." "You should go," Thomas urged. "There are too many of them, and they have repeating rifles." The chief regarded him with surprise. "You warn us? Even now? I don't want more bloodshed. Not on my land. Not anywhere." Maka was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something that flashed gold in the sunlight. He held it out to Thomas. "A cavalry medal. My father took this from a soldier who came to our lands many winters ago. A soldier who did not kill, but who spoke of peace. He carried a picture of a woman and a small boy." Maka's eyes fixed on Thomas. "The woman wore a necklace with a cross, like the one hanging in your cabin window." Thomas stared at the medal, recognition dawning. "My father disappeared in Apache territory in '49. We never knew what happened to him. He saved my father's life during a sickness that took many of our tribe. He taught us words of your language. When other soldiers came and killed him, my father kept this to remember the white man who was different." Maka pressed the medal into Thomas's palm. "Now his son has saved my son. The circle is complete." The approaching riders were close enough now that Thomas could make out Sheriff Cooper and Colonel Blackwood at their head. Behind them rode Frank Miller and the men from town, along with 24 cavalry soldiers. "Kindness might cost me my life today," Thomas murmured, "but cruelty would have already killed my soul." He turned to face the approaching riders, stepping forward so that he stood between them and the Apache. Sheriff Cooper reined in his horse, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief at the sight before him. "Thomas, what in God's name?" he began. Colonel Blackwood cut him off, his cold eyes taking in the scene. "So the reports were true. A settler harboring hostiles." His hand moved to his sidearm. "Step aside, Mr. Harker. These savages have raided American homesteads and killed American citizens. Justice will be served today." "There'll be no killing on my land," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. He held up the medal. "This belonged to my father, Lieutenant Michael Harker, 2nd Cavalry. He disappeared in '49 while trying to negotiate peace with the Apache." Blackwood's expression didn't change. "Your family history doesn't interest me, Mr. Harker. Step aside or be charged with treason." "The Apache who attacked the Miller place aren't these people," Thomas continued. "This is Chief Mahaka's band. They've kept to the treaty. They helped my father when he was lost in their territory." "All Apache are the same to me," Blackwood said coldly. "Now move aside before I have you arrested." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Thomas didn't move. Behind him, 500 warriors waited, arrows nocked, lances ready. Before him, 30 rifles were aimed at his chest. At that moment, Nalan stepped forward to stand beside Thomas. In halting English, he spoke. "This man gave water when I was dying. He is brother to Apache now." He turned to the colonel. "We did not attack White Farm. We keep peace." From the ranks of settlers, young Jacob Miller pushed his horse forward. His arm was bandaged, his face pale from blood loss. "Pa, it wasn't these Apache that shot me. The ones who raided us had different paint, different shields." Frank Miller stared at his son in disbelief. "You never said." "Because you never asked," Jacob exclaimed. "You were so ready to kill any Apache you found." Sheriff Cooper seized the moment. "Colonel, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. These people haven't broken the treaty." Blackwood's face flushed with anger. "I don't need evidence to do my job, Sheriff. The Army has authorized me to remove the Apache threat by any means necessary. And I'm authorized to keep the peace in this county," Cooper replied, his hand moving to his own weapon. "There'll be no massacre today." For a terrible moment, it seemed Blackwood might give the order to fire anyway. Thomas held his breath, feeling the weight of hundreds of lives in the balance. Then, surprisingly, the colonel smiled, a cold, thin smile that never reached his eyes. "Very well. But when these peaceful Apache raid another farm, the blood will be on your hands." He turned his horse sharply. "Men, we're returning to camp." As the cavalry withdrew, the settlers lingered, uncertain. Sheriff Cooper approached Thomas. "You took one hell of a risk, Thomas. Still are." He glanced at the warriors surrounding the ranch. "What happens now?" Before Thomas could answer, Chief Macaw stepped forward. "Now we talk peace. Real peace, not paper words that white men forget." He looked at Thomas. "This man will speak for us. He has proven he can be trusted." In the days that followed, Thomas's small ranch became an unlikely meeting ground. Representatives from the Army, though not Colonel Blackwood, the territorial governor, and 5 Apache bands gathered to negotiate a new treaty. Thomas served as mediator, his simple kitchen table the site where grievances were aired and compromises reached. The agreement they forged wasn't perfect, but it brought a measure of peace to the valley that had known too much bloodshed. The Apache agreed to help identify the renegade band that had been raiding farms. The settlers agreed to respect tribal hunting grounds. On the day the Apache prepared to return to their lands, Chief Maca stood with Thomas on the porch of his cabin. "My son says you live alone," the chief observed. "No family." Thomas nodded. "My wife passed years ago. My daughter's in Denver." Maca considered this. "Among my people, a man with no family has no one to remember his deeds when he is gone." He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "But now your name will be remembered in Apache stories. The man who stood alone against many rifles to protect those not his blood." Thomas watched as the Apache rode away, their hundreds of painted ponies raising dust that glowed golden in the setting sun. For the first time in years, the empty chairs in his cabin didn't seem to mock him. One man's simple act of kindness had rippled outward, changing not just his own fate, but the course of an entire region. A month later, a stagecoach arrived from Denver. Thomas looked up from mending his fence to see a young woman descending, her eyes searching until they found him. "Emma?" he called, scarcely believing it. His daughter ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "Everyone in Denver's talking about what happened here," she said, tears in her eyes. "About what you did. I couldn't stay away after hearing that my father had become a legend." That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Emma asked, "Weren't you afraid, standing alone against all those guns?" Thomas fingered the stone eagle and cavalry medal he now wore on a cord around his neck. "I wasn't alone," he said quietly. "And sometimes, daughter, doing what's right gives you a courage you never knew you had." The peace that began that day at Thomas Harker's ranch would last for 7 years, longer than any treaty before it. Though conflicts would eventually return, the story of the rancher who gave water to a wounded Apache, who stood alone against 500 warriors and 30 rifles, became legend throughout the territory. It was a reminder that even in the most divided times, one person's compassion could bridge the deepest chasms of distrust. If you found yourself caught between two worlds at war, would you have the courage to stand for what's right, even if you stood alone? Subscribe for more powerful frontier stories like this one, and click on the video on the screen to watch the next tale with a twist so unexpected it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about courage.